If you watched my last video or have been keeping up with the latest video game news, then you'll know that Rockstar has found itself in a bit of a PR scuffle after a contentious statement that co-founder Dan Houser made during an interview with website Vulture. According to Vulture's article, after flaunting how the game will feature a 60 hours long campaign, how hundreds of thousands of animations and lines of dialogue were implemented, and how tons of lines of code were written, Dan proudly blurted out how they worked 100-hour weeks several times throughout 2018. It wasn't long before games industry pundits picked up on this and began to express their disdain towards the notion that an executive might be boasting about overworking their employees, as excessive crunch has been a pervasive problem in the gaming industry that's burned out many of its best talents. As word about all of this began to spread, Dan quickly clarified to website Kotaku that his quote regarding working 100-hour weeks was taken out of context. He claimed that he was only referring to himself and 3 other people in the senior writing team having worked that hard for 3 weeks voluntarily to get some much-needed work done. He also insisted that nobody at the studio is forced to work hard, that additional effort is a choice. Now, I said before that even if it is indeed true that Dan's statement to Vulture was taken entirely out of context, that didn't rule out the possibility that crunch might be a factor at Rockstar. At the same time, I thought it was best not to make any assumptions until testimony or evidence surfaced, though Rockstar did face a similar fiasco 8 years ago, months before the launch of Red Dead Redemption 1, when spouses of Rockstar developers released an open letter complaining about how the studio made employees work 12-hour days, including Saturdays, how staff was being treated like machines rather than humans, how the studio was constantly being dishonest about deadlines and the extent to which crunch would have to be endured, and how this all induced stress and associated health problems. That's all I had to go on in my last video, but since then, new testimony has in fact surfaced, speaking out against Dan's claims that working long hours at Rockstar was entirely optional. One such testimony was provided by Twitter user Rosie, who posted the following string of tweets in response. It reads, quote, "I worked at Rockstar a decade ago. Nothing has changed since then. Your angry tweets probably won't change it now. This shit is ingrained and systemic in the games industry. You do it or you get out. The industry loses so many good people because of this, yet it never changes because there are people that are proud who browbeat it into people who don't know any better, and thus the cycle continues. I worked 80-hour weeks at Rockstar until I had a breakdown. If I hadn't, my contract would have been terminated. There are plenty of ways to force a person. Fuck you very much. At one point, 3 people lived in my 1-bed flat, working 3 different shifts because QA was working 24/7. We took turns sleeping. This was a decade ago, but I suspect not much has changed. That place is a toxic mess, and I'm finally far away enough from it to be done being scared of saying this." Now, one aspect of her testimony that many will likely point to is the fact that Rosie is speaking from an experience she had a decade ago. While there is no reason to doubt the validity of her testimony from back then, especially since spouse complaints against Rockstar followed not long after, which corroborated much of what Rosie experienced, some might argue that a lot can change in a decade, that perhaps things have taken a turn for the better at Rockstar since. The thing is, though, Rosie isn't exactly wrong when she says that this kind of excessive crunch is ingrained and systemic in the games industry. The fact of the matter is that I can't recount a time when a studio, particularly in the AAA segment, actually went out of its way to adjust management style in consideration of giving hardworking employees reasonable respite and compensation for their hard work. The fact remains that crunch continues to be a problem in the gaming industry because it's something employers have just been able to get away with, and in turn, something they're not incentivized to address. Given the general landscape of modern-day gaming industry, it does raise the question, did Rockstar really change for the better over the last few years, or is Dan's clarification a way to save face? We know Rockstar does have a well-documented history of employees complaining about working conditions, but we haven't heard much about it in the last few years. With games in general having gotten more sophisticated and deadlines only more strict, is it easier to believe Dan's claims that employees work reasonable hours now, or is it easier to believe that Rockstar crunch hasn't really changed at all or possibly gotten worse in the last decade? Something to ponder upon. Moving on, another ex-Rockstar employee who tweeted their experience was a Twitter user going by the name of Aaron Stewart Un. His testimony was much more brief, but expressed similar disdainful sentiments. He said, quote, "I've worked in the film and games industries. Speaking only for myself, there have been times where I worked 100 hours in a week happily and proudly. Rockstar, I quit after only a few months." This was in response to a tweet by Waypoint reporter Patrick Klepek, who expressed that he feels as though bragging about 100-hour work weeks is irresponsible without placing that in the broader context of labor exploitation, something Rockstar has been credibly accused of. Even if Dan was only talking about 100-hour work weeks for himself and his 3 cohorts, as he claims, games industry pundits see Dan flaunting that as being in poor taste, as this kind of work regiment is not something to be taken lightly or be seen as a point of pride, given how prevalent labor exploitation is in game development. One last ex-employee who I'd like to highlight is a Twitter user going by the name Dylan, who responded to Games Industry's report of the story by simply tweeting, quote, "Survivor of GTA 5 crunch here, it was hell." Thus, other Twitter users then proceeded to ask him questions about his experience, with one user asking how bad the crunch was back then. In response, Dylan said the following: "Probably 12 to 14-hour days, 6 days a week. Sometimes we were given the choice of which weekend day we wanted off. Probably lasted for a year as the crunch hours go on way past release to cater for post-releases, DLC, etc." From there, when asked about payment and compensation, Dylan had this to say: "You do get paid for it, which is at least better than some studios, Telltale for example. The problem is that the salaries for the games industry are still way below an acceptable level. You could get a job as a developer QA in a generic software company and get paid 5 times more." Dylan then discussed how he quit Rockstar after working there for 3 years, how he decided to go traveling with the money he had saved up before returning to find a new job, and how just up and leaving a company one might be dissatisfied with isn't easy for other people as they have families to support and mortgages to pay. He also highlighted how employees had no say on their working conditions, noting how those who complained would be thrown into a pile of people who will never progress, possibly have their bonus reduced, or outright sacked. Dylan is seemingly much better off now working at BBC for 4 years now, where he never worked a minute of overtime, and while he acknowledged games are much larger scale endeavors, he expressed there are much better ways to manage game development than current processes. One Twitter user asked if people should boycott this game to express their disdain towards Rockstar's employment practices, to which Dylan responded with, "A boycott isn't the right way to go about it. All it would do is undermine and insult the effort people have put into the games, even if by terrible conditions. The only way to fix the problem is from the very top. We need to move away from traditional release calendars and hype." When pointed out that this is unlikely to happen without unionization, Dylan agreed. Another interesting response Dylan provided was to a user who tweeted, quote, "Entrenched practices and the fear of reprisals, compounded by the narrative that you should be lucky to work in games and that there's a long line of people eager to replace you." Dylan wholeheartedly agreed with this response. This is 100% spot on. There's a massive element of emotional manipulation involved. If you don't put in the same hours as your peers, you're pretty much fucked for any career progress. Not exactly fair when comparing single people who can work loads more than married people. One last tweet of Dylan's I'd like to highlight is one he posted in response to Jason Schreier's tweet featuring the clarification statement Dan Houser provided to Kotaku, which reads, "Forced to work hard is essentially defining working hard as doing long hours. Such a joke of a comment." What Dylan is referring to here is the language and diction that's used in Dan's statement. Notice how Dan refers to people working overtime as working very hard and passionately, and later states that no one is forced to work hard, as if to insinuate that those who don't choose to partake in overtime work aren't working hard or working passionately. There are undertones that imply that if you don't overwork yourself, you're being lazy or that it's not hard work, which goes in line with what Dylan was referring to when he talked about how those who aren't willing to work overtime or put the same hours as their peers are pretty much fucked for any career progress. In other words, the implication is that Dan Houser may not be lying about working 80 to 100-hour weeks being optional, but at the same time, working anything less than that may be woefully discouraged by how you're treated if you don't go that extra mile, if you don't quote-unquote work hard or express your passion. So employees may have the choice of working regular hours rather than partaking in an unhealthy crunch, as Dan claims, but those people may be perceived as not working hard enough or not being passionate, and in turn may stagnate when it comes to rising through the ranks. Overtime may not be mandatory, it may not be forced, but it may be the expectation. It may not be directly stipulated, but it may be what will sustain employees at the company. That's at least what Dylan sees in Dan's language. I will say that given this kind of work mentality is actually nothing new in the games industry, given how many reports there are out there of studios instigating this kind of unreasonable work ethic that propagates staff to forcefully work long hours, by choice, quote-unquote, I can definitely see merit in Dylan's perspective here. Now, as of the publishing of this video, Rosie, Patrick, and Dylan were the most prominent ex-employees I could find that directly spoke out against the glorification of 100-hour work weeks and Dylan's clarification on that front. Brief testimonies from 3 former developers hardly paint a complete picture, but at the very least, there is tangible reason to believe that Rockstar is far from innocent when it comes to the issue of game development crunch. Then again, these former employees spoke of experiences that range from a decade ago up to Grand Theft Auto V's development, so we haven't heard any employees discussing how working conditions have been throughout Red Dead Redemption 2's development process. Whether Rockstar has changed its employment practices since GTA 5 is something that I cannot confirm or deny until staff on the project share their experiences. But I will say that given the current landscape of the gaming industry, given how at least from Red Dead Redemption 1 up to Grand Theft Auto 5, working conditions have been admonished by a number of individuals who were close to those projects, I once again raise the question, is it easier to take Dan's word that Rockstar working conditions are fine and dandy, or is it easier to believe that things haven't really changed that much these past few years, or have gotten worse as game development becomes much more demanding and sophisticated? Well, if you're not entirely sure what to believe at this point, it would seem as though we might not have to wait long to find out more information, as Jason Schreier, investigative games journalist extraordinaire, has recently expressed his desire to write an article about working conditions at Rockstar, stating that he's wanted to do this for quite some time now, and called on anyone who has worked there to reach out to him via direct message or via email and share their personal experiences. When asked why he's specifically picking Rockstar to discuss the industry-wide issue of excessive crunch and developer burnout, he responded by stating that he wishes to explore and publicize what it takes to make the biggest game of 2018, and without question Rockstar's most ambitious project to date. I'm gonna hold judgment on this whole fiasco until Jason does what he does best and gives us a more comprehensive overview of this situation. At this point in time, I don't want to fully discount Dan's clarification that the 100-hour workweek statement was taken out of context and that he was only referring to a handful of willing individuals, but I also don't want to disregard tangible feedback against Dan's glorification of such a work regimen, or the testimonies that paint a completely different picture regarding Rockstar's work environment, testimony from ground workers who have first-hand experience. Though I would say it is definitely worth pondering what exactly having the choice of working hard actually means. Is it really a choice when you're punished for not going that extra mile, for not deciding to be willing to work yourself to death? Anyway, I'll be sure to keep you guys updated as more information about this is revealed and as more people start to speak out, whether publicly on social media or anonymously via outlets like Kotaku. And if you're a former or current developer from Rockstar and would like to reach out to me for whatever reason and provide some insight, my business email can be found in the About section of my channel. I want to emphasize that the whole point of this isn't to paint Rockstar as this evil company or anything like that. This isn't some smear campaign. Nobody will deny that Rockstar has produced and continues to produce some of the most compelling, incredible, most boundary-pushing games of our modern time. There is no denying that we love their games. But ultimately, you have to consider that the ones handcrafting our games with meticulous care are the ground floor developers, and it's important to to address the less than ideal situation of these talented individuals, not just within Rockstar, but within the games industry as a whole, even if that means calling out highly regarded studios. Games don't make themselves. Names and brands aren't what comprise the soul of a game. It's the human beings and the creative force behind them. And the longer the issue of unreasonable working conditions for game developers remains unaddressed, the worse the gaming industry will continue hemorrhaging existing seasoned talent, and the less inclined new talent will be to join this field. Talent that can go a long way in realizing high-quality games and making game development more efficient. I'll leave it at that for now and conclude this news update and discussion video. Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoy my content and would like to support this channel directly, consider donating on Patreon. And to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Yong Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Yong out.